Right now, a small dial on your wall is keeping you alive. And you haven't thought about it once. You set it to a number, 68, 72, and winter simply stops at your front door. But for over 300,000 years, your ancestors had no dial, no walls, no heat they didn't build with their own hands, and the winter they faced would kill you. We're not talking about the cold you feel walking to your car. On the Ice Age steppe, it hit 40 below. Cold, where exposed skin starts to fail in minutes, where breathing hurts, where the wind doesn't just chill you, it hunts you. A modern human dropped into that winter unprepared would likely be dead before sunrise. And yet your ancestors didn't just survive it, they thrived in it. The question is how? The popular image is always the same. Shivering cave people hunched around a tiny fire, barely making it to morning. Archaeology tells a completely different story, a story about engineers. And the first thing it corrects is this: they mostly didn't live in caves. Across the Ice Age world, we find pit dwellings, homes deliberately dug down into the earth. Because about 2 meters below the surface, the ground holds a temperature roughly 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the air above. Your ancestors didn't fight the cold, they went underneath it. But the real sophistication came later. Look at the walls. At Dolní Věstonice, in the Czech Republic, around 26,000 years ago, we find shelters with walls built in layers, and each layer did a job. Innermost, animal hide, fur turned inward, trapping a cushion of warm air against the body. Around that, dried grass and moss, pulling moisture away from the warm core. Outermost, woven mats of reed and bark, enough to break the wind, but breathable enough to let moisture escape before it could freeze and crack the shelter from inside. That is the exact principle behind the insulation in your walls right now. Modern homes use foam and vapor barriers. They used hide, moss, and bark. The materials changed, the physics didn't. And here is where it becomes extraordinary, because in Ukraine they didn't just build shelters, they built houses out of mammoth. At sites like Mezherik, archaeologists uncovered dome-shaped homes made almost entirely of mammoth bone. Skulls weighing over 90 kilograms set as foundation blocks. Curved tusks arched into frameworks. Hundreds of smaller bones packed in to hold it together. The whole dome wrapped in stitched mammoth hide, thick enough to stop the wind, shaped precisely enough to shed snow. That is not survival instinct. That is architecture. And when modern researchers rebuilt these houses and tested them, the results genuinely surprised them. A well-built mammoth bone house could hold an inside temperature around 40 to 50 degrees warmer than the air outside using only modest fires. Stone Age builders, working with bone, hide, and stone tools, reached warmth that stands comparison with modern Arctic shelters. Let that sit for a second. But a warm shell is nothing without a way to heat it, and their heating was planned. A central hearth threw out the main warmth. Smaller hearths ringed the edges, creating warm zones for specific jobs. Food prepared here. Tools made there. Infants and the elderly kept nearest the warmest spots. The layout wasn't random. It was designed. Then there was the problem of fuel. On the treeless steppe, wood often didn't exist. So they engineered an alternative: dried mammoth dung, bone, processed to burn hotter and longer. Chemical traces in old hearths show these fuels were deliberately prepared, not just thrown on the fire, but managed for the heat they gave off. They weren't burning whatever they could find. They were running a fuel supply. And then, the detail that impresses modern engineers most: ventilation. Seal a shelter too tightly, and moisture from breathing and cooking builds up. In deep cold, that moisture freezes, and the structure fails from the inside. At Kostenki, we find carefully placed openings, low ones to pull cool, fresh air in, high ones near the peak to let warm, damp air escape before it could freeze. That is a heating and ventilation system, designed by people you were taught to picture as brutes. So step inside one after dark. The fires are low. The wind is screaming somewhere far away, on the other side of the bone. And here your ancestors did something you've forgotten how to do. They slept in two halves. 4 hours of sleep, then a waking hour, or two, in the deep middle of the night, then 4 hours more until dawn. In 1992, psychiatrist Thomas Wehr took modern people and removed all artificial light for a month. Every one of them drifted back into exactly that two-phase pattern. So that gap wasn't wasted. It was for feeding the fire and for each other. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner found that by day, most talk was practical. Tracks, tools, food. But at night, by firelight, most of it became something else. Stories, myths, ancestors, the beginning of the world. The bone house wasn't just a furnace. It was the first theater and the first classroom, and it was where the art was made. Many of the paintings and carved figures of this age come from the long winter months, made by firelight, while the steppe outside was locked in ice. Art is the fingerprint of time you don't have to spend surviving. They had bought themselves that time. Everything else was engineered to the same standard. Chambers cut into the permafrost worked as natural freezers, keeping meat frozen and reachable through the worst storms. Clothing followed the same logic as the walls, layer on layer of different hides, each chosen for a job. Wolf, fox, Arctic hare, an inner layer to trap warm air, an outer layer to shed wind and snow. The same design as your winter coat, worked out 25,000 years before Gore-Tex. And when a shelter took damage, which was often, they fixed it immediately. Bones replaced, hide patched, insulation refreshed. This wasn't a thing they built and hoped would last. It was a living system maintained every day. And none of it was improvised. Building a mammoth bone house took 8 to 10 adults, 2 to 3 weeks of hard work. Which means it had to begin in late summer, long before the cold made outdoor work impossible. These weren't people reacting to winter. They were people with a seasonal calendar running in their heads. Then the Ice Age ended. The world warmed, forests spread, and this entire body of knowledge was quietly set down, not lost to disaster, just no longer needed. And here's the humbling part. Militaries now teach survival shelter methods drawn from these ancient designs. Disaster relief teams use the same principles for emergency shelters in extreme cold. We reinvented with modern science what your ancestors had already solved perfectly, with bone and stone. So go back to that dial on your wall. The number on it is something your ancestors would have called a miracle. Not because they couldn't make warmth, they could in cold far worse than you'll ever feel, but because making it cost them everything. Weeks of work, months of planning, a precision so exact that one mistake could mean a family frozen before dawn. You didn't invent warmth, you inherited it from the most ingenious engineers who ever lived, people who had nothing but cold, time, and the refusal to die. So the next time winter comes, and you reach for that dial without a second thought, remember what it once cost, and understand maybe for the first time how rare it is to be warm.